Or is this full-time MMA now?
I love full-time MMA right now.
Back to the daily grind, and shout out to the full-time patrons. Make sure to hit subscribe if you're new and hit thumbs up if you're not a baby back bagel biting bitch boy, cause you know what time it is. It's full-time
MMA.
And it is time to predict UFC 226 Miocic versus Cormier. Let's fucking go, full-time family. Who is not ready for this card? It's coming up next week at July 7th. But don't forget, the night before, we've got the Ultimate Fighter finale that's headlined by Israel Adesanya and Brad Tavares, which is also going to be a good night of fights. But that Saturday is the night we're all waiting for. UFC 226, starting all the way from the early Fight Pass prelims to the Fox Sports 1 prelims. We got nothing but slugfest. I'm talking, night could set a record for the most knockouts on a fight card. Like, I wouldn't be surprised. That's the type of fights the UFC has lined up for UFC 226. And of course, the mother of all slugfest, the Django Unchained Mandingo Madness Ngannou versus Derek Lewis is going down on the main card. Can't wait to break that down and get into that fight and watch that fight. Gonna be a great fight, but so are all the other fights on the card. And if you're interested in a breakdown and predictions of those fights, including the newly added Paul Felder versus Mike Perry, make sure you check out the Full-Time MMA Dojo at patreon.com/fulltimemma. And don't forget, also on the prelims, you've got fights like Paulo Costa versus Uriah Hall, Rob Font versus Rafael Assunção. Just a great night of fights in general, great weekend of fights. But let's get straight into this main card breakdown and prediction, starting with the first fight of the night. That's going to be between Gokhan Saki and Khalil Roundtree Jr. Now, in this fight, I'm pretty confident in my prediction. That's what you can see in the red. That's my how confident I am in my prediction for each fighter. But yeah, man, this fight, we've got a kickboxing legend coming over, Gokhan Saki, and he's going to be taking on Khalil Roundtree Jr. Now, this is going to be Gokhan Saki's second UFC fight. He's looking to remain undefeated in the UFC against the explosive striker Khalil Roundtree Jr., who's coming off of a decision loss back at UFC 219 after stringing together back-to-back first-round KOs over Daniel Jolly and Paul Craig. I'm picking Gokhan Saki to win this fight via KO TKO, as he's definitely the more experienced striker, and to beat him, I think it's going to take a more grappling heavy game plan. And Khalil Roundtree Jr. is yet to score a takedown in his UFC career. He's fought 5 times in the UFC and he hasn't scored a takedown in any of those fights. So unless he decides to change up that game plan and decide to mix in some wrestling, and I'm sure if he really had those skills to rely on, he might have already had a takedown in his career. So I expect someone to go to sleep in this fight. Gokhan Saki could get caught, of course, but he's a lot more experienced as a striker, as he's coming over from a straight kickboxing background. So yeah, I got Gokhan Saki in that fight. Moving on to the next fight, which was rescheduled from UFC 223. Of course, after the Conor McGregor Dolly attack, Michael Chiesa was someone that was scratched from the glass or cut from the glass. He had a cut on his head, he was bleeding, so his fight was rescheduled. He's taking on Anthony Pettis. Pettis is a former UFC lightweight champion who is 2-2 in his last 4 fights, only losing to Max Holloway and Dustin Poirier, with wins over Charles Oliveira and Jim Miller. Michael Chiesa is coming off of a first-round submission loss to Kevin Lee, which snapped a 3-fight winning streak with wins over Mitch Clark, Jim Miller, and Beneil Dariush. This is a hard fight to call, but I think Pettis will actually have the strike-striking advantage in this fight, and he's also skilled enough in jiu-jitsu to defend Chiesa's submission attempts if Chiesa gets the fight to the floor. So I'm giving the edge to Pettis, but for me, this fight's almost a toss-up because Chiesa may have the slight grappling advantage. But with that being said, I'm giving this fight to Anthony Pettis by a slight margin. You can see I'm not super confident in the pick, but I do think if the fight remains standing, he'll have the edge. And even if Chiesa takes him down, I think Pettis will be able to either fight off his back. He could even throw a submission attempt. I mean, Anthony Pettis is very talented himself. He was the former UFC lightweight champion for a reason. And although he did lose, to some fights and tried to move down to featherweight and fought Max Holloway in the interim featherweight title fight, after beating Charles Oliveira. He had a hard time cutting that weight, but since then he's came back up to 155 and he got that win over Jim Miller. Now I do think Michael Chiesa is higher competition than Jim Miller, but maybe not necessarily the same level as Dustin Poirier, who could be fighting for a title soon. So if Pettis gets a win here, I believe he'll actually reclaim his spot in the top 10. I think he slid out of the top 10. He might be ranked number 12 right now. But I think he's definitely got a chance in this fight. And he may even be the underdog, you know what I'm saying? But with that being said, it's almost a toss-up for me. I got Pettis. That's who I'm rocking with. Next, we got a heartbreaker for me. Francis Ngannou versus Derek Lewis. One of my favorite fighters, one of a lot of people's favorite heavyweights for sure. Derek Lewis, man, he's coming in here. This is like the fucking fight, almost the people's main event. I mean, if you asked a lot of people, this is probably the fight they really want to see. Of course, Max Holloway versus Brian Ortega's up there for me. Those are my two favorite fights of the night for sure on the pay-per-view. Lewis versus Ngannou and Holloway versus Ortega. But with that being said, let's get into this breakdown. We got Francis Ngannou coming off of his first loss, which was a UFC title fight against Stipe Miocic. That was his first loss in the UFC. Before that, he was 6-0, lost that fight. Now he's 6-1 in the UFC. A lot of people feel like Francis Ngannou was exposed for not having great grappling or cardio in that fight, but I'm not sure if he'll really need either of those if that was the case to win this fight against the Black Beast Derek Lewis, who's coming off a come from behind win over Marcin Tybura. He was losing the first 2 rounds of that fight arguably and got that 3rd round, you know, KO TKO. But before that, he lost a 4th round KO TKO to Mark Hunt. And in that fight, some people thought Derek Lewis's cardio was looking kind of suspect, but he did say it was a back injury and whatnot. So either way, if this fight goes into the 3rd round, it'll definitely be interesting. But if Derek Lewis can avoid being KO'd in the first 2 rounds and conserve his energy, you know, be efficient with his energy, he could potentially earn another come from behind win in this fight as he's done before. But I don't expect Ngannou to gas out after the 1st round, you know, because when he was fighting Stipe Miocic, it was the biggest fight of his life, or whatever, you know, that means. I mean, I'm sure I feel like he would have been ready for the moment, but who knows? He could have had a fucking adrenaline dump. Who knows? A lot of stuff could have went into his first title fight. And also, he was going against Stipe Miocic, who had a game plan of holding him against the fence, you know, kind of draining his energy, taking advantage of that cardio. This isn't a 5-round fight. Francis Ngannou's had time off, you know, and in a title fight, even if he didn't have an adrenaline dump, you could imagine if he was trying to get Stipe Miocic out of there early, he could have overextended a little bit and possibly, you know, been inefficient with his energy. So I don't expect him to do that, just come out here and expending all of his energy in the 1st round against Derek Lewis and fucking gassing out after the 1st round. But maybe after the 2nd, so he's going to have to get something done. I feel like the later this fight goes, the better the chances get for Derek Lewis, but I'm still picking Ngannou. But I'm not super confident. This is a heavyweight fight. Derek Lewis could get a 1st round knockout himself. You know, it's not like Ngannou's the only one that can get a knockout in the 1st round. Lewis can definitely do that as well. So Lewis has the potential to win this fight, but I'm picking Ngannou to get the W in this fight. About 65%, as you can see right there. So I got Ngannou. Moving to the co-main event. If you want to be the best, you have to beat the best, and the best is blessed. Max Holloway, he's taking on Brian Ortega. This is another one of my favorite fights of the night because you cannot count Brian Ortega out, man. And this super fight is so hard for me to call, and I feel like a big reason is because Brian Ortega's eyes. Like, there's just something about his eyes. Like, if you're thinking about picking against him, you like just see his eyes staring back at you in your head. You know, how can I pick against this guy? Especially if you know Brian Ortega's story, man. He's got like the foundation to help all the poor kids in the world, and you know, he's got like the blue eyes, and he's got like he's undefeated. He gets all his victories come from behind. He's soft-spoken, very calm, cool, and collected, but still from the streets. You know what I'm saying? He don't do too much talking. He's about that action. Even if he's down in a fight, he's coming from behind. That's how a lot of his fights have came. That's how he got to where he is now, man. He's finished every single fight in the UFC. A lot of those fights he was behind in, but he managed to get the 3rd round finish or the 2nd round finish. He might have been losing the striking. He might have been getting taken down. It don't matter. He's able to submit off of his back. He's always dangerous. And a lot of his fights, yeah, he might have been losing on the judges' scorecards, but he doesn't leave it to the judges' scorecards. He gets the finish in the 3rd round, and he's just been getting better and better since then. He got most recently that 1st round KO over Frankie Edgar. He didn't even need to come back in that fight, and he was the first to finish Frankie Edgar. So Brian Ortega definitely has the skills to pay the bills in that kill, because no one's ever done that to Frankie Edgar. But still, he's going against blessed Max Holloway. So it's hard for me to pick Ortega, even because Max Holloway is the champion. I don't think he's going to make that mistake. I don't think you go on a 12-fight winning streak and become the champion and defend your belt and do everything Max Holloway has done by making a mistake when you're ahead in the fight. Now, Max Holloway, he has shown a tendency before he was the champion. One of my favorite moments in UFC history versus Ricardo Lamas in the 3rd round. Hey, I'm already winning this fight, but let's risk it for the biscuit. Max Holloway's done that. Definitely has. He pointed to the mat. He was already winning the fight. He could have got knocked out by Ricardo Lamas, but he won that exchange. But I don't see him risking it for the biscuit against Brian Ortega. If you just, he's going to know Brian Ortega's threat when it comes to submissions. T-City, Brian Ortega, Triangle City. Max Holloway, when you look at it, one of the things Brian Ortega said about Cub Swanson is like, I was looking at his neck like, man, I'm grabbing onto that thing. He's got a nice, long neck. I'm grabbing onto it. Max Holloway is one of the longer fighters, you know what I'm saying, in the featherweight division. I could see Brian Ortega looking at his limbs like, which one of those am I going to get? He could very well get a submission in this fight. And as we saw in this Frankie Edgar fight, he could get a KO. But if it goes to decision, I think that's 100% Max Holloway's fight. We've never seen Brian Ortega in 5 rounds. Also, Max Holloway, he usually fucking is winning every fight he's in from start to finish. He's not usually coming from behind, you know what I'm saying? So in that sense, he's very likely to be winning this fight. And I really think Brian Ortega's chance to win this fight is going to be a come from behind finish. I don't think he's going to come in here and fucking blast Max Holloway in the 1st round and get that KO. That would be absolutely crazy. And Brian Ortega would become even a bigger star if that does happen. That's a very real possibility. Just because what we saw him do to Frankie Edgar that no one else has done. But I think in order to beat Max Holloway, you're going to have to actually be a better fighter. Now, anybody can get caught slipping, and I think that's what's going to have to happen to Max Holloway. Brian Ortega is going to have to catch him slipping to win this fight if he exposes that neck. But I think if Max Holloway fights a smart fight as the champion, which I think he'll be able to do, he comes out with the win. So I'm picking Max Holloway to get the W. But if Brian Ortega, he could very well shock the world in this fight. And maybe some people wouldn't be shocked, with what he did to Frankie Edgar and what he's done throughout his career. You know what I'm saying? Picking against Brian Ortega, I kind of feel like a bad person. But hey, man, you know what it is. In order to be the best, you got to beat the best, and the best is blessed. So it is what it is. I'm picking the champion, Max Holloway. Hasn't lost since he lost to Conor McGregor 12 fights ago when he was just a baby in the UFC. Max Holloway was about to step up on short notice and fight Khabib at UFC 223. That's the type of dude we're talking about here. You know what I'm saying? Max Holloway ain't no joke. So I'm rolling with Max Holloway. I still fuck with Brian Ortega. And of course, win or lose, I want to be a fan of both of these guys. Moving to the main event, the champion versus champion super fight. Stipe Miocic versus Daniel Cormier. Light heavyweight champion versus heavyweight champion. Stipe Miocic, arguably the greatest heavyweight of all time, versus Daniel Cormier, arguably the greatest fighter of all time. I'm not talking about just light heavyweight. I'm talking about DC, motherfucking double champ. That's what the DC stands for if he wins at UFC 226. No more of that double cheeseburger nonsense. He will forever be DC, the double champ. I think he might even pass Conor as far as, I think double champ DC sounds just a little bit better than champ. When Conor says that champ shit, it does sound kind of fly, and it's forever gonna be iconic. But DC, Daniel Cormier, That literally stands for double champ. So if he can get that W, that'd be crazy. But it's going to be a tough task against Miocic. But first, we got to talk about Daniel Cormier, because yes, I'm picking him to lose the fight, but I'll just say this: if he upset me and shocked the world and everyone else that thought he couldn't beat the heavyweight champion, and DC's been through so much shit in his life, to, you know what I'm saying, and his skills in wrestling are some of the best on the planet, so you can't count DC out. That's something you can't do. And I feel like I'm kind of doing that here. And that's why I'm kind of rooting for DC to upset me in this fight. This is a prediction that I will not be mad if I get wrong. Because Daniel Cormier, man, if he wins this fight, he makes his case for greatest fighter of all time. Only person he's ever lost to in his career was Jon Jones. And Jon Jones failed his drug test after those fights. After that fight, the most recent one for sure, UFC 214. And so that result was overturned. Their first fight took place in January 2015, if I'm not mistaken, and USADA didn't kick in until about July. So with that being said, that, you know, I got my skeptical hippo eyes open at the first fight. I still want to see DC versus clean Jon Jones. And if DC wants to end his career the picture perfect, he's going to have to come in here and get this win. He's been talking about fights with potentially Jon Jones and Brock Lesnar, but he doesn't, those fights aren't even possible if he doesn't win this heavyweight belt from Stipe Miocic. If DC loses this fight, he's pretty much, in my mind, only option is to kind of go back to light heavyweight and defend his belt a couple times before he retires. But he's still going to have a place in the sport. One of the best commentators in my mind already out of, you know, there's a lot of new commentators that have been coming in and trying out. DC's just one of the best. The Rose, just you know what I'm saying? He's into the fight. I mean, that's just one of his other. Also on the sports desk, I mean, you know what I'm saying, on the Fox or ESPN now, soon to be desk. So even if DC's career, his fighting career, doesn't end picture perfect with a win over Miocic and a super fight versus Jon Jones and a super fight versus Brock Lesnar, he's still got a bright future in the sport of MMA, and he'll still always be around. But with that being said, if he does win, it also wouldn't necessarily surprise me all the way. I mean, a lot of people can't count out DC, not just because of everything he's been through and what he's done in his career, but also because he was undefeated at heavyweight before he moved to light heavyweight. Daniel Cormier fought guys like Frank Mir, Roy Nelson in the UFC after coming over from Strikeforce, winning the Strikeforce Heavyweight Grand Prix, and he won those fights. He was 13-0 at heavyweight. It's not like he's new to this. Daniel Cormier's true to this. He didn't want to beat Cain Velasquez, his champion for the heavyweight title, didn't want to fight him. Moved down to light heavyweight, and he beat everybody there, except for Jon Jones, who failed his drug test. He even beat Rumble Johnson twice, and he beat Gustafsson. You know what I'm saying? So DC's got a chance in this fight for sure. And another thing is, Stipe Miocic comes in at about like 245 pounds. It's not like he's a guy that cuts to 265 like Francis Ngannou or Brock Lesnar or Curtis Blades or the big heavyweights. Stipe Miocic is a guy that walks around about 245. So you know what I'm saying? He's not even at the heavyweight limit. So even though this is a heavyweight versus light heavyweight super fight, the size is that much. The size difference is still not as big as you might think. DC coming in at heavyweight, I mean, he might come into this fight, in my mind, 220, 230. If he was 240, I would be surprised if he was the same size as Stipe. But still, his strength is his wrestling, and as a wrestler, you know, size kind of matters for sure. You know, if he was going against a striker, a heavyweight striker champion, like, he would have a lot better chance. But Stipe Miocic also has great wrestling himself. He's beat a lot of the best heavyweights in the world, and Alistair Overeem, Fabricio Verdun. Most recently, he was able to out-muscle and out-grapple Francis Ngannou. Now, that's a big dude there. So even though Ngannou doesn't have the wrestling skills as Daniel Cormier, Stipe Miocic has showed he's able to control a much bigger guy. Now, Cormier's skills are the part that are going to really be the X factor here. Are his pure wrestling skills going to be that much better than Stipe Miocic's to win the fight? Because you're not really expecting Daniel Cormier to knock out Miocic you're not really expecting him to submit Miocic. If Daniel Cormier is going to win this fight, you kind of expect him to have to be able to really out-wrestle Miocic. And I think that's going to be a tough task. You know, it's an uphill battle for sure. So I'm going with Miocic to win the fight, but it's definitely not a fight that I would be upset if I was wrong about. I'm a big fan of DC and just him challenging for this belt. You know what I'm saying? He's putting his undefeated. It's not like he's got nothing to lose here. A lot of the times in a champion versus champion super fight, you got nothing to lose. If Demetrius Johnson goes up and fights TJ Dillashaw, he doesn't lose his belt. It's not like he was undefeated at 135, so he's ruining his legacy at 135. He just lost to the bigger guy. If Amanda Nunes fights Chris Cyborg, she doesn't lose her belt. It's not like everyone was expecting her to win the fight. It's like, okay, you lost the fight, you keep your belt, you get paid, big challenge. You know, it's not really, you're not losing a lot. It's not like you had a legacy intact at the higher division. DC does. He's 13-0 at heavyweight with wins over Frank Mir and Roy Nelson and these guys. And he was the Strikeforce former heavyweight Grand Prix champion. You know, and with that being said, if he loses this fight, he's no longer undefeated at heavyweight. So he's actually risking a part of his legacy by taking this fight with Stipe Miocic. But he's risking it for the biscuit. Because, yeah, he's risking something. But if he wins this fight here, holy smokes, did he just hit the jackpot, you know, with the fights he really wants. The John Jones rematch. It would be like John Jones trying to win both belts back from Daniel Cormier, even though he would only be fighting for one in a given fight. That would probably be the only way people even wanted to see a John Jones versus Cormier 3 fight at heavyweight if DC was the champion. But at light heavyweight, I don't know if we want to see it again. Maybe just because we want to see it clean. But he also wants to fight Brock Lesnar. You think that happens if you lose this fight? I don't think so. So we'll see what happens, man. Gonna be a great night of fights, great weekend of fights, and this is the main card breakdown and predictions. And don't forget, if you want to see the rest of the card, man, the Mike Perry versus Paul Felder, Uriah Hall versus Paulo Costa, I'll give you a sneak peek, man. I think that Paulo Costa is going to take the torch and beat the clout out of Uriah Hall. But if you're interested in those predictions, make sure you go check out the UFC predictions 226 early fight pass and the Fox Sports 1 prelims over on patreon.com/fulltimemma. Let the full-time family know what you think in the comments. And before we go, shout out to all the full-time MMA white belts that have hit the subscribe button. Make sure you also hit the notification bell right next to it so you're notified every time I upload a video. And if you want to become a full-time MMA blue belt, purple belt, brown belt, or black belt, all you have to do is go to patreon.com/fulltimemma. I'm out.
Bye, Felicia.